Hi everyone, I want to give you an update on my sorcerers. After patch 1.1.1, I was quite excited to try a Fireball Sorcerers, and I gotta say it has been an absolute blast all the way so far. This is kind of like a work in progress, so I want to give you an early update and then have like some full level 100 endgame version of this, but I have no doubts that I will blast through even tier 100s later on without really much trouble. This build has been a very smooth progression, and I had probably the easiest transition into World Tier 4 that I've had so far out of all of my characters, and that includes all of the rogue builds I've played, etc. It is quite powerful with the recent buffs, and as you can see here, I'm just like shredding through those nightmare dungeons on the lower levels. This is me being kind of fresh in Torment difficulty without really having like, optimized gear, anything like that. So this is only going to get better from this point forward. In this video, I will show you the skills, the paragons, and the items, of course, that I'm using for this. As I mentioned, this is something that I'm currently working on and leveling towards 100, but eventually we're going to have probably some update on this as well. But I did prepare a maxwell planner here, so we have a few different setups with, without, illuminator, etc. These are some uniques here. And I also have a level 50 codex only power that you can work towards if you want to level this from the start. So I'm going to go through all of these. But as you can see here, blasting through those nightmare dungeons is like extremely fast. The AoE damage is insane. And even the boss damage is just fine, as you can see here. This is a setup there where I equipped the barber. So this is a very prominent heart right now in this season that a lot of builds are using. But I also have played this without the barber. So I deliberately left out the barber to try out, how the build feels, and I gotta say it's still a blast here. As you can see me here, I'm like underleveled by 11 levels against these Helltide monsters in Torment difficulty, and I have no trouble whatsoever. So there is like one main difficulty you have to solve in this build, which is the mana regeneration, but that can be done with a codex power and then maybe some mana reduction rolls and some resource generation rolls later on. And the build will feel very smooth to play with very high AoE damage, and it usually has just enough damage to actually defeat those Nightmare Dungeon bosses where you don't run out of mana, because you can actually cast your fireballs for a few seconds straight without spending any mana, giving you massive damage buffs when you use Inferno, the big ultimate skill, and that is usually just enough to make sure that you don't run out of mana ever. There's one unique in particular that is important for this build, which is the gloves of the Illuminator. This one was recently buffed and now is like the item for Fireball. It is a fairly common drop as far as I can tell, so it's not really hard to get. I've already found like 2 or 3 of them or something at level 70, so not a big deal, I think. And I have also tried to build without any uniques, and it was still fine. It was working, not as good as with the unique. This is a pretty powerful item. But I was able to still progress, I was able to kill elites, and it worked. So you can definitely do that from the start. There is a second unique, which is the staff. This is the Staff of Endless Rage. That is probably more of a kind of a mid-tier item, like something for progression. Right now, I'm actually using this staff, and I feel pretty nice with it. But I think late game, one-hand and offhand with good rolls is gonna beat this. But for now, it's kind of easy to find this because it's also a rather common unique, so I'm wearing this. As you can see, I have a staff equipped, and it feels really nice because sometimes you have these like fireballs spreading out, they go a bit like in a cone in front of you and just like decimate the entire screen. And even at this fairly unoptimized stage I'm in right now with my character, where my gear is not really great, my aspects are lacking severely, etc., it feels already great, and I have no doubts that I will not really struggle through a tier 100 later on, once I actually get to level 100 and I have like some decent optimized gear. So this definitely seems like one of the better Sorc builds to me. I don't think it's gonna beat Blizzard necessarily. That is probably a bit on another level, but it's a superb build. I'm having a lot of fun. You have explosions everywhere. And you also have these nice chain reactions, as you can see here, where the Fireball enchant, that is also in one of the enchant slots, starts like just exploding on every enemy you kill, and then you can like explode entire packs in one go, basically, especially with the buffed Nightmare Dungeon density. This feels amazing to play. So let's go into the setup. So I have the planners here. It is relatively straightforward to level and to play, I guess. So let's start with the level 50 version, where it's a little bit different because we use the generator here. Later on, we do drop the generator for Flame Shield because we're just gonna cast Fireball only. But early on, you don't really have the luxury of having enough mana regeneration. you want to use Fireball a little bit, and it actually does some decent amount of damage in the early game anyway. The main skill here is Fireball, so we get the extra radius when we cast it ourselves compared to the enchantment that just has a smaller explosion and also less damage. So these are not worth the same. And then we have the Destructive Fireball for extra crit damage. This build, being a fire build, has lots of extra crit chance, crit damage. There are some aspects that play into that. For example, the Elementalist aspect here. You get, just from the Codex power on the amulet, you can get 30% crit here when you cast at 100 mana. So you usually try to stay at high mana, or at the very least on the boss, when you cast Inferno, your skills cost no mana, so you can benefit from this for like, 4, 5, 6 casts in a row or something like that. And you just have like massive extra damage. And then there's also the 3 curses aspect that also plays into this crit like scaling, where you deal 40% multiplicative more crit damage. Again, with the Codex power, this can roll up to 80%. And then you get double this bonus against healthy targets. So it's very easy to one-shot monsters on a crit. And even elites, sometimes they just pop in one explosion or something like that. It's pretty crazy. And there are some other crit synergies down here. So there's the Aesos Ferocity, the key passive for fire builds, that again gives you 5% crit chance, 25% multiplicative crit damage again. And you get both of these bonuses against bosses, which is amazing. And there's also Devouring Blaze, where against burning targets you have, again, extra multiplicative crit damage. So this really scales up your damage through the roof. There's also some more stuff on the Paragons later that I'm going to go into. And eventually you're going to have basically 100% crit chance all the time. And those crits are going to be massive. So this is where this build is going later. I'm not quite there yet at my level, but I'm pretty close and it feels superb. Next in the skill tree, we pick up Teleport, Ice Armor, and Frost Nova. You see I have here like a few extra ranks in these skills. Early on, I would just go like 1 point each, and then once you have those extra points, you're close to a level 50 and Renown, etc. I'll just like start investing a bit more in Teleport to smooth out the movement a little bit, but it's not really required early on. So this is just like these 1 point skills. You can even leave out the upgrades here if you want. One important one is the Enhanced Ice Armor here. It gives you extra mana regen, you want that. And another one is the Mystical Frost Nova for the Vulnerable. So this is the only source of Vulnerable in this build, but it's kind of sufficient. Most of the time when you blast into a pack, it doesn't really matter if enemies are vulnerable, they just like explode anyway, at least the small trash monsters, and even elites sometimes when they're surrounded by a lot of small monsters. You have the Fireball enchant going off, and yeah, just chain reacting everywhere basically. And then sometimes you have like an elite alone in a corner where you don't have these extra explosions, and this is the time when you press a Frost Nova. So you can get this extra vulnerable damage. And for example, on the boss, you use that. So for example, my opener is always 1 Fireball, then I cast Frost Nova, then I cast Inferno, and then we have the Vulnerable, we have the free casts, we have the Elementalist aspect giving us extra crit for being at high mana, and the boss explodes basically. So this is the combo there. Here are a few defensive passives. While you're leveling, I wouldn't really pick up mana shields. This is something for later. I would do like maybe 1 point align the elements and like 1 or 2 here in protection just to gain those extra barriers. They are very helpful for survival. There's also this here, Icy Veil, that synergizes with the barriers. There's also something to pick up kind of late. And here is Inner Flames, very powerful for fire skills, extra damage. And then Devouring Blaze. Once you get those crit synergies online, this just, plays even more into that and gives you more damage. And finally, down here, the Inferno. So as soon as you reach down here, you want to pick up Inferno, because it pulls enemies together and it gives you no mana cost for your pyromancy skills, so you can spam Fireball. So this is useful sometimes when there's an elite and you are out of mana, you just press this, or on the boss as I have just shown. And finally, the key passive down here. So you definitely want to prioritize Firebolt and Fireball early on. You will cast your basic skill quite a lot because you don't have enough mana in the early game, but it gets better and better as you go. And then eventually, once you have like more endgame gear, you'll actually completely phase out Firebolt. So this is like the one swap you make. We get Flame Shield later, where we get extra movement speed, we get immunity, we get Unstoppable of course, and we get the mana cost reduction here. If you want, if you feel too squishy or so, you can also swap this to the healing. So especially on the higher tiers, I think for like T100s and stuff, this is probably what I'll go with. But for the regular farming, you just press a potion here and there and you're fine. And then you have even more defense. You have all of the defensive skills, and the build starts feeling really nice once you have some mana cost reduction, some mana regeneration, etc. Going into the items, the main thing that you want to get early on is Prodigy's aspect. You can unlock this. The entire level 50 setup here is only Codex powers, so this is almost the entire build already actually, and there's only like a few different adjustments you make. But Prodigies in particular is an important one. You get this in Havazar, in Witchwater, and it gives you 15 mana when you use a cooldown. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 cooldowns, and later even 5 with the Flame Shield, so you can kind of like cycle them back and forth to gain mana. And this is how you keep up your mana high. You do have to be a bit careful either way. The mana cost is relatively high and you only really have this to restore mana. There is Fiery Surge on the skill tree, which gives you lots of mana regeneration, but unfortunately this is bugged and doesn't work and doesn't do anything at all. Else this would be a really nice pickup here, but what can you do? So for now we have to rely on that. If you find another aspect later, you can do aspect of concentration. It is not really required once you have really good setup, but for now I'm actually running with this and it feels kind of nice. Some of the other aspects I already mentioned, so we have the 3 curses, so this is the extra crit damage, the elementalist for extra crit chance, so you want to unlock these early on as well. Even though your mana is not always great, you can be at full mana because of the Inferno sometimes, and sometimes you just have downtime between the fights, so you always get this buff at least here and there. A few other Codex powers here defensively. We have Protector for extra barriers. We have the Snow Veiled, it gives you extra armor with Ice Armor and Unstoppable. So that's yet another source of Unstoppable. There's actually 3 skills that give you Unstoppable. You basically never get crowd controlled in this build, because Ice Armor does it, Teleport breaks it, and you have Flame Shield later that also gives you Unstoppable and immunity. So you definitely don't have to worry about any crowd controls here. Early on I run with Edge Masters, not really the most important aspect, but it's a bit of extra damage. And we have the Disobedience here, the extra armor. This is a very powerful aspect. And on the boots, I like the Ghostwalker. Later on, I also found Azu's Heirloom. This is the unique boots that gives you extra crit chance based on your movement speed. This is definitely something you can use while progressing if you feel like you need a bit more damage. But because we have all these sources of Unstoppable in the build, Ghostwalker is really nice and this scales up to plus 25% movement speed. And I kind of like running fast. And finally, we have the rapid aspect here. This is a bit of a filler. So because in the early game, we are out of mana, sometimes at least, the idea is that with the Fireball enchant, you burn enemies when you hit them the first time. So you cast like 1 or 2 fireballs into the pack, everything is burning. And if there's survivors, you start casting Firebolt if you're out of mana with 5 points investment. And you pierce through everything that is burning already. So the Fireball burns them. And then you also gain mana for hitting burning enemies, so you can refill quite quickly as well if you have to. And it's like a relatively decent early game single target option as well for the bosses, for example. The burn is actually relatively significant until later on you unlock more of those crit synergies and the Firebolt is just not really doing much anymore. This is why it's getting phased out here. But for the early game, Rapid is pretty nice to synergize with that. For endgame leveling, the setup can change a little bit, but as I mentioned, almost everything here is actually Codex power. So there's not really much you have to find. It's really great. One thing here, concentration. So this is kind of nice, at least early on, but I think later on also not required anymore. And this can be replaced with something like Conceited, for example, or the Ancient Flame. So we have that here. This gives you extra attack speed while Azu's Ferocity is active. This is the key passive down here with the extra crit and crit damage. So this can also be useful here. But right now I'm actually not running that. Because I have the unique stuff and I left this one out. I feel this is kind of like really good for blasting down the bosses fast if you need boss damage, but otherwise it just makes your mana struggle a bit worse, and early on I would not necessarily include this. I think in the very late game towards level 100, when you actually have like really good items and especially a lot of resource generation rolls, so for example here on the rings, this can definitely replace something like the concentration aspect, and you might actually be able to just like perma-spam fireballs all the time at that point once you have those resource generation rolls. So I'm looking forward to trying that out. But for now, I think this is definitely a really useful tool here for progressing at least. And now speaking of the stat rolls on the items, I mentioned the resource generation. This is something that only appears on the higher level items. So you can't really get this in the early game, but this is a very powerful roll. And then you have like quite typical crit damage, crit chance. Vulnerable damage is not bad to have, even though we have low vulnerable uptime with only the Frost Nova in the build. The vulnerable damage helps you to blast down those bosses, and this is where really it matters, because almost everything just explodes anyway. Then we have some stuff like all stats maybe, or int, that you can get on the weapons. Of course, you want to have the fireball ranks, at least when you don't have unique love. You want Fireball here. And of course, cooldown, armor, defensive stats in particular on the chest and the pants. So you want to have these like triple or quad damage reduction mods, similar to this maybe. And if you can, a little bit of extra life. So you can have that on helm, maybe on the rings. So you can get that. Mana cost reduction, similar to the resource generation, is very important because it's a very mana hunger build. So you want to have that on your amulet for sure. If you can, also on the boots. And this helps you a ton to just like smooth out the playstyle. And then again, you have cooldown, you have a passive here, like Devouring Blaze is very powerful. There are a few others as well, like for example, Inner Flames exists, so you can roll that as well, or even something like Elemental Dominance, Glass Cannon. So there are a few passives that you can roll here that are all kind of useful. And Devouring Blaze is probably a bit better than the rest there. And movement speed is just like extra quality of life and farming speed. Not really super quiet on the amulet, but you definitely want to have that on the boots. Now let's jump into the Paragon. So this is the setup I made here. We have 5 boards and 5 glyphs. There is one legendary node in particular that you want to pick up, which is the Searing Heat here. So this gives you up to 15% crit chance. It's definitely going to be up all the time, basically, as long as you're in combat. So this, again, helps you to cap out your crit chance. You always have 100% crit chance, basically, with Elementalist up and Aesos Ferocity up and Searing Heat up. So that feels amazing. You have like very consistent damage output that way. And the rest is mostly just optimizing around some glyphs and some rare nodes. So nothing really crazy here. The glyphs that we are using are Flame Feeder, gives you extra damage against burning targets. We have Reinforced, it's like a nice defensive tool here, 15% damage reduction, and buffs the rare nodes where you have the burning enemies. So it gives you even more damage reduction here. This is a very defensive one, and I picked this up relatively early. The thing is that Reinforced needs to be level 15 to be activated here, so you can swap out some glyphs early on. You don't have to like attach the first board and put Reinforced there. If you can't activate the secondary effect, I'm using, for example, right now Destruction and Flame Feeder on my early game setup, because it's easier to activate some of these other glyphs if they're not level to 15. At level 15, they increase in radius and you can pick up more nodes around it to get the secondary bonus. So something to keep in mind here. You always want to have something active there. Then we have the Enchantment Master board. Here's the Territorial Glyph. This gives us extra damage reduction against close enemies and close damage, and a bunch of rare nodes again. So we pick up a lot of these non-physical damage nodes, a lot of fire damage nodes, some life nodes, damage to burning enemies, damage to elites. It's pretty straightforward stuff here, most of these nodes, but they're all kind of helpful and make it so that you just become more powerful as you progress. Then comes the next board here, Searing Heat. So this comes actually quite late, as you can see. But yeah, at around, I don't know, level 75 or 80 or so, you're definitely gonna have this online together with this. Then you get the Searing Heat. You can also like rush up here if you want and just pick up Searing Heat and then do this later. It doesn't really matter too much. And finally, we have the last board here, the Elemental Summoner board with the Exploit Glyph. This is just to gain a bit of extra mana. So there's this mana nodes here that just help you with the Elementalist aspect mostly. So you can just cast more often with this bonus active. And then we put the Exploit Glyph here for more vulnerable damage. So whenever we fight the boss, whenever we cast Frost Nova, we just have this vulnerable uptime, and then we also have this stacking damage effect here. And that's what I have to share here for now. So this is my work in progress Fireball Sorc. It feels really fun, so I'm quite looking forward to leveling this all the way to 100. I might do a respec again for Chain Lightning. I wanted to try like both builds a little bit. I've also done some clips about Chain Lightning, and I'm gonna talk about that in a separate video. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, so far I'm having a blast with Fireball, and I'm gonna keep you guys updated with what comes out of this once we reach the 100. For now, I hope you enjoyed this. We also have a Maxwell guide for Fireball that was written by Northvar, which yeah, probably goes in a similar direction with many things. So you also can check out the written guide there if you prefer that. And this is linked in the description. Other than that, hope you enjoyed this. I wish you good luck with your Sorcerer, and see you guys next time.